Hi, Diagnostic Hysteroscopy. How does that work in practice? I am Dr. Drizi and I'm pleased to share the basics with you in 4 steps, plus a bonus at the end. And for those to whom it matters, the same video exists in French. Now, the fact is that this video is mainly practical. It was conceived for the gynecologists, whether in training or not, who really want to perform diagnostic hysteroscopy, but who either don't know much about it. In fact, there are a lot of countries where endoscopy remains way too underused, or they know but still cannot make it. They're scared, they don't feel like they can do it, emotional unreadiness. If that's your case, this video is for you. Just go ahead and check it step by step. And think of pausing the video whenever necessary. That's the good part about recordings. You can pause the video anytime you want and as long as you wish. And again, this is really practical. The point here is not to talk about theory. Actually, theory is everywhere else in books. And of course, everyone should read books anyway. But here, the point is to talk about practice, those things and tips that cannot be detailed in books. Let's just think of it as a practical session. Meanwhile, I think it's indisputable that everyone should increase their theoretical knowledge. Because truth is, we don't want to pretend that this work replaces the academic teaching of hysteroscopy, especially that I'm no expert in this matter. I'm rather at my very first steps, and that's precisely why I love doing this work now, because now I'm still aware of the real difficulties that we all encounter as beginners, and of course the way of overcoming them. Therefore, I want you to know that this is a personal initiative, the sum of modest efforts which took me almost 4 years to completely mature. It's also a volunteer work. I wasn't paid to do it, so it's worth what it's worth, and I do it for free. Nobody has to pay to have it. So if you ever had to give money to have this, I'm sorry, but you've just been scammed. Let's get into details now. Hysteroscopy is largely developing nowadays. Abnormal uterine bleeding, peri- and postmenopausal bleeding, infertility, recurrent pregnancy loss, etc. Hysteroscopy is the key because it allows us view with our own eyes the inside of the uterus, to diagnose intrauterine problems, to perform biopsies. Under visual control, it's capital. In diagnostic hysteroscopy, here is how we define it and the stuff we say about it in all the books. The general principle appears very simple. Yet, what about practice? Why don't we feel, for most of us, like capable of performing it? And why, despite taking part of workshops and training sessions, a lot of physicians still feel like they're scared to go for it on their own? Why do we feel like we need someone with us? Why can't we make it through? Because to make it through, we first have to overcome the real difficulties that a beginner encounters. Yet, these limits seem to be organized around 4 levels of difficulties, or blocks, and to each of us the level where it blocks. The first and most important difficulty is, stay tuned, psychological. Yeah, mental blocks, limiting thoughts. In our minds, it's complicated. That's just complicated, it's not obvious. And so we feel like we can never do it for real. Our second level of difficulties is our total or partial ignorance of the equipment. Actually, as gynecologists, we all know the uterus by heart, yet not the equipment we use to examine the uterus. One must admit that for a very long time, The equipment was unavailable in many countries, like Algeria, for example. We could barely see it on pictures. So, force of habit, we remain intimidated by the details of the equipment, by the way of handling it. The technique, it looks way too complicated, especially for someone who lives in a zone where people are not that much used to endoscopy. Third fact, the technique. Well, the truth is, we hardly know the equipment, so when it comes to using it, it's a whole other problem. Welcome to anxiety. What if we couldn't insert it? What if we caused harm? What if we caused uterine perforation? And once inside the uterus, could we really interpret what we see? What's normal, what's not? What if we missed a cancer, for example? And the worst part is that all these difficulties feed into one another. The more we're mentally blocked, the more we find all the rest complicated, and vice versa. Because the more troubles we have with the equipment and the technique, the more we're scared and overwhelmed with limiting thoughts. Just like a snake eating its own tail, we lock ourselves in a vicious circle and no longer know how to get out of it. So what do? We do a lot of training. We attend a lot of sessions, here or elsewhere. We are convinced that this is the only way to work it out. Yet, instead of feeling better about it, we have the surprise to discover that, despite it all, we're still scared of performing hysteroscopy by ourselves. I don't feel like I can do it yet. Says who? Well, why? Because with these training sessions, we work on our theoretical knowledge, but not necessarily on our mental blocks. So, how can we work it out? That's kind of the point, after all. Truth is, to each type of difficulty, a level of solutions, in 4 steps, like 4 levels of difficulties. To psychological issues, a psychological step, very important, or just vital. To the equipment issues, developing familiarity with the tools we use. To the technical difficulties, familiarization with the directions and precautions for use. And to the anxiety of missing the diagnosis of cancer or other lesions during the procedure, having knowledge and memorizing the hysteroscopic images. So it's 4 steps: psychological, the equipment, the technique, and the atlas of reference images. The point is to do more than dream of diagnostic hysteroscopy, which means performing it for real. So let's begin with the most important part of all, the psychological step. A step 4, growing awareness. Actually, we have to be aware of our context. We live in a country where for too long, really for too long, hysteroscopy was unavailable and therefore inaccessible. Only an active minority could perform it, which left the majority with a growing feeling of incapacity. Because truth is, not having the right to do something puts it, consciously or unconsciously, in a particular frame, the one of it's complicated, it's not obvious at all. Because consciously or unconsciously, it is thought that what everyone does not know how to do is necessarily difficult. Otherwise, everybody would do it. Yet, that's not the case of diagnostic hysteroscopy. It really goes the other way around. Now, go and tell that to a community who has lived all these years in the inaccessibility of this procedure. In their minds, it's complicated, it's not easy. And when we watch experts do their thing, we feel like we're ages away. Somehow like a beginning driver next to Schumacher. Which brings us back to the first part of all, the psychological work that is necessary. We must grow awareness of the fact that diagnostic hysteroscopy is not complicated at all. It's just our environment, our background, that makes us believe so, as just explained. Once we get conscious of that, we'll have a different look on the equipment and the technique. Everything becomes clearer, easier, in its right and true proportion. So first and most important step to take is getting rid of our mental blocks. And for that, let's just raise our consciousness and awareness of 3 simple facts with 3 simpler examples. First fact is that no, diagnostic hysteroscopy is not complicated. It's even much simpler than a DNC or dilation and curettage, a procedure that even a first-year resident performs in Algeria, for example, and that all the gynecologists around the world can perform as well without any particular anxiety. Do you just realize it? Here in the lab, just take a look at all what a first-year gynecology resident can perform. Endometrial smear or biopsy, IUD insertion, CND, inserting various curettes in big uteruses, softened by pregnancy, even molar ones. And he's very happy. I don't know, it's like blindly and happily. It could be a slogan. Yet, in the right, you have a licensed gynecologist who obviously can perform all of the procedures a first year can do. And when performing these blind procedures, no one is particularly scared of uterine perforation, for example. Although all these procedures are done blindly, so reasonably, it's here that we're supposed to have a bigger anxiety because we perform all these intrauterine procedures blindly. We don't see anything. But when it comes to doing it with a camera in your hand, everybody is freaking out. We're scared of causing perforation or other complications now that we see everything thanks to the camera we hold in our hands. Is that even rational? Is that logical? Do you just realize it? Which brings us back to the fact that fear is really psychological. Meanwhile, I don't mean that everyone should go for it without thinking or considering the risks. I think that everyone knows that any procedure in medicine should be taken seriously. We don't want to make it look inconsiderate. That would be stupid. But we don't want to make it look complicated neither. Just bring it back to its true proportion by dragging your attention to all the intrauterine procedures that you usually perform without any particular anxiety, even if they're blindly done. Plus, if you're a gynecologist, you do know that there are risks in every procedure in medicine, including hysteroscopy. But thinking of hysteroscopy as being more complicated than a blindly performed DNC, for example, I don't know, I just doubt it. And just for your information, diagnostic and office hysteroscopy are nowadays considered routine procedures. Alright, moving on to fact number 2. If you really want to drive a car, you have to be alone behind the wheel. And so does it go for diagnostic hysteroscopy. Because if you want to stop being a beginner driver, well, you have to take the wheel alone. That's the way it works, you know. And guess why? Because if every time you want to drive, you take a coach with you, you'll never drive. And everybody knows that. Because your coach will always tell you what to do and what not to do. Therefore, you'll never know how you would have handled the situation if you were on your own. So, you'll feel less secure about yourself, less and less confident, even if you're increasing your knowledge. But you're breaking your confidence. And this, whether the coach is a mean guy like this one, or sweet as a doll as this one. The fact is that the beginner driver knows, deep down, that it's the coach who's driving, not him. So, the fact is, to learn driving, there is an indisputable moment where you have to go for it alone. And that day, you'll feel exactly like a beginner. Not quite comfortable, tensed, hesitating, focusing on a million details all at once. You'll feel the need of doing it slowly and carefully, and that's precisely why beginner drivers never have fatal accidents, because they're particularly slow and careful, which is a great thing in hysteroscopy. And that day, all that you learned in theory will come up to the surface when facing real situations, and only then you will understand its real meaning. This is the way we learn driving. It doesn't go the other way around. And the good news is that the more time passes, the more comfortable and confident we get. Even Schumacher had to go through the beginner driver step one day. It's true that I can hardly imagine him, but that's just the way things work, even for Schumacher himself. Like in swimming, you can watch the whole planet swim. If you don't do what it takes to get in the water yourself, you'll never swim. So why on earth do you want it to be different in diagnostic hysteroscopy? That's the learning curve, actually, just the way it works. And the last thing is, to take the wheel alone, we have to understand the phenomenon of the little girl playing with the dough. There, Mommy is preparing a cake. Her little girl is excitedly watching her. She wants to do the same, and she asks for it. Ma, can I do it too? Oh, I just loved imitating the little girl. So, with a big smile, the mother gives her daughter a little piece of dough, and the child works it and makes different forms with it. She's very excited. For the first time she's touching the dough. Her mommy might also get it cooked for her in the oven. So the little girl has the feeling of someone who's just baked a cake, although she's just played with the dough. Because the cake, it's Ma who did it. And if little girl wants to eat a new one tomorrow, she perfectly knows that she'll have to ask for it from Ma. And in diagnostic hysteroscopy, it goes the same way around. Actually, when we take part of workshops, we often have the happy feeling of the one who's just performed hysteroscopy for the first time. Meanwhile, we just played with the dough, or surgical tools in this case. If we truly want to perform hysteroscopy, we have to do exactly like the mommy when it comes to baking a cake, which means knowing the ingredients and the way of combining them all together comes to knowing the hysteroscopy equipment by heart and the way of assembling it. That's what step 2 is gonna be about. 2. Knowing how to shape the dough comes to knowing how to handle the hysteroscope and deal with the technical aspects. And that's what step 3 is gonna be about. And 3, knowing the final result so as to remove the cake from the oven comes to knowing the different reference images of the uterine cavity, which will indicate the end of the procedure and the removal of the hysteroscope. And that's gonna be talked about in step number 4. As you see, there's no place for improvisation. We have to know all these things. So there we go. Increasing awareness of our mental blocks, the main obstacle between us and practice. After that, we take the wheel alone, and for that, steps 2, 3, and 4 will help us learn how to quit playing with the dough to finally be able to prepare the cake by ourselves. So first thing, the ingredients or the equipment, whatever. Step 2, the equipment. Now, big chances are you're not quite familiar with the equipment yet. Or need I say not at all? Well, I got a huge tip for you. You want to get familiar with something? Touch it. That goes for hysteroscopy in particular, and for anything in life in general. You want to know something by heart? Just go ahead and touch it. And in this video, I'm touching it for you. Just try to live vicariously through me. However, if you have a hysteroscope equipment at hospital or at your office, just go ahead and touch it, starting from tomorrow. Even if it's different from the one I use here in this demo. Get it out, watch it, and touch it. You'll see that the general principles are the same. Besides, you should never depend on anyone to prepare and assemble the equipment for you, not even your room nurse. You have to know how to prepare and assemble the equipment yourself. But of course, that if you really want to be the one who prepares the cake, because if you want to keep on playing with the dough like a little girl, well, it's up to you, But I think that you don't want to play with the dough anymore. You want to make the cake, right? So, you know what you have to do. Get familiar with the ingredients. The tools. But before, it's just as important to understand that the general principle is very simple and consists of 2 thins and 3 attachments. Yeah, 2 thins and 3 connectors. You're curious to know about them, right? The first thin, well, as the general principle is simple, it consists of examining the inner layer of the uterine cavity with our eyes. For that, we need tools because we can't take our eye and put it inside the uterus. That's just not possible. That's not happening. Even if we have big blue eyes like this one, it just can't work. So, what do? There had to be a way to indirectly slide an eye inside. This mean is called a scope or endoscope. We use a scope, a word that simply means a viewing instrument, a device used to see something. That's what an optical system is. Example, a telescope is a scope that allows viewing the stars in the outer space. A hysteroscope, on the other hand, is a scope that makes it possible to view the inside of the uterus. Well, just for your information, a lot of authors call the hysteroscope telescope as well. But the thing is that that's what a scope is. It's just a device that we can see through. Remember, there are 2 things and 3 attachments. The scope is the first thing. Here is a real rigid hysteroscope. It's a long, hollow tube with an objective lens at its distal end, number 1, the one that we insert in the uterus to view the endometrium. A proximal end, indicated by number 2, called the eye place, where we place our eye to see inside the uterus, and a small attachment or connector near the proximal end, indicated by number 3, called the light attachment. We'll see why later. The scope we use here in the demo is rigid, but there are flexible hysteroscopes as well, rarely used in gynecology, even if they allow a larger field of view, because actually their problem is, a higher cost, a bigger diameter, and a shorter durability. So we prefer rigid hysteroscopes over the flexible ones. Number 2, the rigid endoscopes we use in diagnostic hysteroscopy should have a small diameter, between 2 and 2.9 millimeters. This one we use here is 2.7 millimeters. The point is that we can insert them without the need for cervical dilation, which causes trauma and alters the image interpretation. So it's always good to have a small diameter. The third point is about the viewing angle. It's very important. It can go from 0 to 70 degrees, more or less. The 30 degrees telescopes offer the best viewing angle for the diagnostic approach. We'll talk about this more later. And as we already said, a scope is a device that we can see through, like here. We see a white piece of paper in the left and a blue sponge in the right. Plus, we must always check the scope this way, by seeing through it. And we do this before leaving it to the room nurse or after taking it back to make sure that it isn't broken, like there is no scar, no fracture in the lens. Now, a master rule, a scope should never be left unprotected because it's very fragile. We do not have to leave it without protection. So we either put it in its plastic cover when we don't work with, or in its diagnostic or operating sheath when we work with. That's a golden rule that we have to respect. Here is a hysteroscope in its black plastic cover. We don't want to leave it without protection, remember? True, we did leave it naked a few while ago, but that was just for the needs of the demonstration. You have to know that both the scope and its cover can be sterilized in an autoclave. So we take the cover off only when we want to perform a hysteroscopy, and then we insert the scope inside a metallic sheath, the diagnostic sheath, for a diagnostic hysteroscopy. And that would be the second thing. Remember, the first thing was the scope. The second one is the diagnostic sheath. And here's what a diagnostic sheath looks like. It's the second thing. It has a long hollow tube too, where we insert the scope to protect it, a screw to lock it so it doesn't move, that's number 2, and a connector for the fluid supplied with a stopcock. And here's how we assemble the hysteroscope with its diagnostic sheath. We put it inside the sheath and we lock. And to assemble them, notice the 2 streaks on the sheath that we first have to align. Once aligned, they correspond to a little bump right there on the inner side of the sheath. We will adapt it to the small notch on the scope, and there it goes, the 2 are assembled. And at that moment, we turn the small screw and we lock the 2. They can no longer be detached. Just pay attention to the streaks, huh? If not aligned, there's no way the device is assembled. You want a little video for the demonstration? So there we go. The bump on the sheath and the little notch on the scope. We insert the scope inside the sheath carefully, and then we put the bump against the notch, like that. We lock. It doesn't fall. And the final result, we have a scope inside the sheath with a distal end, number 1, and 3 attachments indicated by number 2, 3, and 4. And if you want to effortlessly keep them in mind, let's just get back to the general principle. Actually, we've already seen that the point is to examine the inside of the uterus with our eyes. The scope happens to be the tool for that, since it allows viewing. However, the problem is that inside the womb, it's dark. Yeah, it's dark. The light doesn't get inside the uterus. So what do? A lamp? A mobile phone? That's not practical. We use a source of cold light. Cold light won't burn the illuminated tissues, unlike hot light. Now, how can light, which is produced by the light source, get inside the scope and the uterus? For that, it had to be transmitted from the source to the hysteroscope. The light cable takes care of that. It's the gray part in the picture. It's made of fiber optics. It's a fiber optic cable light, very fragile too. And here's how it looks like in real. You have the cold light source in black, the light cable in gray, and the scope inside the diagnostic sheath. And then all you have to do is to press the button on the light source to have light. You press it again and the light is off. A little demonstration will do good. Here's a scope in its diagnostic sheath, and here's the light cable. We screw the light cable to the scope thanks to the superior screw, only the superior screw. We lock like that. There, it's done. So we connected the first end of the light cable to the scope. The second end of the cable we inserted inside the light source like that. All is left is to press the button there to turn on the light. But before, we should plug it. See, the plug in the wall, it'll feed the light source, which we see here, for example, on the desk. Here's the light source. And the cable will conduct the light till the scope to which it is connected. Here's the light cable connected to the scope. And that's it. Here there is no light. We press the button. The light is on. We press it again. The light is off. Here's how we should wrap the light cable. One circle to the left and one circle to the right. And again, one to the left. The fiber optic light cable is very fragile. We have to watch out for it. Let's sum it up. To examine the inside of the uterus, first thing, we use a scope. Second thing, the scope is in its diagnostic sheath. The set has 3 attachments. The first one is the light attachment, because we need light to be able to see. But can we really put our eye on the scope during the whole procedure? I mean, yeah, we could, but then we'd have a terrible backache. That's not comfortable at all. So what do? Well, we use a camera. We put the camera instead of our eyes, and the camera will see instead of us and project everything on the TV monitor, so we no longer need to hurt our necks. So the camera is connected on the one hand to the hysteroscope and on the other hand to the TV monitor. The equipment used in this demo can be hooked up to a laptop as well, or a TV monitor. The principle remains the same. Here's a video for the demonstration. First, look at the camera. We can rotate the big ring here, and the protector is out. Look at these protrusions here. We rotate the ring, they get in. See? Like that. We rotate the ring in the opposite direction, and they're out. And again, look at the way we rotate the ring. Look at the reliefs, they're out here. We rotate the ring, and they're in. Again, they're out. You see? So, we rotate the ring, again, the big ring. The reliefs are in. We put the scope. We lock. You see? It's very simple. So here we go. We have a scope in its diagnostic sheath, the light attachment, and the camera. We hook up the camera to the laptop. Sorry, I first screwed up, but then it was all right. Besides, the camera is supplied with 2 buttons, a white one and a black one. The white button is for the white balance. The black one is for the recordings. These buttons should always be kept up. And the third attachment is the distending medium. Here, a normal saline. Actually, we connect the irrigation tube to its connector on the diagnostic sheath. And why do we need a distending medium? Just because the uterine cavity is vertical. Take a look at this globe in the left part of the picture, for example. It's flat. Its walls are stuck one against the other. But after instilling saline or water or fluid, You see that the walls are kept at a distance from one another so we can examine inside of them. And that's the point of using the distending medium. Usually we use a normal saline, that's very enough. But in operative hysteroscopy, if we happen to use the monopolar energy, then we will have to use glycine instead of saline. Otherwise, saline is widely enough. You should know that there are a lot of distending media, and you can learn more about them in theory. The connector is supplied with a stopcock. The stopcock is closed in the left, so it's perpendicular to the saline. The fluid doesn't flow. On the contrary, in the right picture, the stopcock is open. It's parallel to the saline tube, so the liquid will flow. Here's how we connect the administration set on the sheath. We take the needle off and we plug like that. And again, a bag of normal saline, the administration set, we insert it inside the sheath's connector, like that. See that the stopcock here, it's closed. We open it, we close it again. So here we go, to sum all things up. We said that the general principle is very simple. 2 things and 3 attachments. The first thing is to see we need a scope. The second thing is that the scope is fragile, so we need to protect it in a diagnostic sheath. This whole set has 3 connectors for 3 attachments. The light attachment, so we can see because we need light. The camera, because we can't put our eye against the eyeplace all the time. And the third attachment goes for the distending medium and normal saline. And that's all it takes. And here's a drawing to illustrate all we've been saying. Now, during a diagnostic hysteroscopy, we can have to perform small and modest operating procedures like biopsies, for example. So how do we do that? For that, we would need a way to be able to insert operating instruments inside the uterus, like a biopsy forceps, for example. So how can we do it? Well, the operating inner sheath gives the answer. Take a look at it. It has, see, down, it has the sheath for the scope. And up, you see a working channel. It's a channel that allows inserting semi-rigid operating instruments inside the uterus. And the white arrow indicates the screw, which, just like the diagnostic sheath, helps lock the scope so that it doesn't move. And so we insert the scope inside the inner operating sheath, exactly like we did with the diagnostic sheath. It's the same technique. And we assemble them together exactly like we did with the diagnostic sheath. See, there is a connector for the irrigation tube, for the light, and for the camera. And after that, we'll be able to insert the operating instruments inside the working channel. We have the example of an instrument here, a biopsy forceps. And that's the little hole where we'll be inserting the instruments inside the channel. See the arrow's direction on the irrigation connector. The arrow goes down, indicating the direction of the fluid's flow. So here, the fluid is instilled, so that's an irrigation tube connector. Now, what if suction was needed? Then we would have to add another sheath, the outer operating sheath, here in blue, which allows connecting a suction tube. See the direction of the arrow on the second sheath. It goes up, which means the fluid is leaving the sheath, like in suction. Now, truth is, for the simple operating procedures we perform during diagnostic hysteroscopy, generally we don't need suction. irrigation is enough. Therefore, we don't really need the outer sheath. The inner one is enough. And I also want to drag your attention to the stopcock that is available on the entry of the working channel. Take a look at the left. The stopcock is closed. See, it's perpendicular, so we cannot insert the instrument. Whereas in the right picture, the stopcock is open. It's parallel to the channel, so the instrument can be inserted. Here's an operating instrument inside the working channel. We open the instrument and see here a biopsy forceps, it gets open. We close it and the biopsy forceps is closed. For the mechanical procedures, 3 instruments are enough. A biopsy forceps up. It has the form of 2 curettes. Down you have a foreign body forceps and scissors. Here's an operating inner sheath with the irrigation connector and the cock stop. Here we close it. And here's the working channel. So we want to assemble it with the scope, but first we have to take off the diagnostic sheath. We took off here the irrigation tube, we unlock, and we take off the diagnostic sheath. We replace it with an operating sheath. See the notch here? There's the notch in the scope. We want to put the bump of the operating sheath. Here's the little bump here. We put it against the notch. See, it doesn't assemble, it doesn't work. Why? Because the streaks are not aligned. See? We always must align the streaks. Now they are aligned. We put the bump against the notch and we assemble and lock. See? Here's the outer operating sheath. It's of a bigger diameter since it will cover the inner sheath and the scope. It has a connector for suction tube supplied with a cock stop too. We're gonna do the assembly exactly the same way. Take a look at the notch here. We put it against the bump that is on the inner side of the outer sheath. It doesn't work. Why? Again, the streak. And we lock this way. As very often, we don't need suction actually, so we don't need an outer sheath. We take it off. The inner sheath is enough. Here. With its irrigation connector, the working channel, supplied with a stopcock, we close it here. The instrument cannot go through, and we open it. So, we don't forget the irrigation tube that we insert in the connector, in its right connector. The stopcock is closed, look, it's perpendicular. And here's the normal saline. So again, here's the scope inside its inner operating sheath. There. An irrigation connector, a light attachment, the camera, and the working channel. Here's an instrument. It's a biopsy forceps, 2 curettes. It looks like that actually, but I know you can't see it with the bad image quality. Sorry. See the other end of the instrument now. We open it and close, open, close, open, close. And you see on the other side, the forceps is doing the same. Now we want to insert an instrument. First thing, no, open the stopcock. Now the instrument can go through. We insert the instrument and we push it slowly and carefully through the working channel until we see it. emerging from the other end. Just take a look with me. See? Here it is. We open and close, open and close. And very important, watch out for the screws. Because actually, you lose a screw, you lose part of the equipment, and then you can no longer work with. So it's very important to be careful. Now we come to the end, to the conclusion. As we already saw, for the diagnostic hysteroscopy, we need 2 things and 3 attachments. The 2 things are the scope and the diagnostic sheath. The 3 attachments are 1 for the light, 1 for the camera, and 1 for the irrigation tube. For performing modest operating procedures, we need, instead of the diagnostic sheath, an operating sheath. The inner one is enough because it provides us with the working channel that allows inserting instruments. So we need sheath, an operating sheath, and instruments. And if you want to perform suction, we will add an outer sheath that provides a suction tube connector. And most importantly, you will have to learn to take care of the equipment. Take care of the equipment. Because if you break it, you'll break yourself, it's that simple. Especially the scope, it's a gem. It's the most expensive part of the equipment. And without a scope, you can't do anything. So take care of it. The fiber optic cable is very fragile too, so don't hit it against things and pay attention to the way you fold it. The light source, whenever you don't need it, turn it off. Don't let it on like that in vain. And very important too, the screws, because you'll lose a screw and you'll be a screw up. It's that simple. One last thing, remember, it's very important to know how to assemble and disassemble the equipment by yourself. You have to know the equipment by heart. Don't rely on the room nurse, for example, to do it for you, unless you want to be like the little girl playing with the dough. But if you want to be like the mummy preparing the cake, you know that. You want to learn the equipment by heart, know how to assemble it and disassemble it on your own. You don't have to need anyone for that. This is very, very important. And so, starting from tomorrow, take your hysteroscope equipment, watch it, touch it, whatever. Just do it. Even if it's different from the one I use here. Again, it's true that there are different hysteroscopes, but the fact is, no matter how different they look from the outside, the general principles are the same. So observe yours, and very soon you'll be able to find out its particular aspects. Now, if you don't have any hysteroscope, I don't know, you either pay one hysteroscope for yourself, or you'll pay a visit to a friend of yours who has one and, keep training. Well, that's it. So, we're done with step 2, the equipment part. And now, step 3, the technique. For the record, we've just seen the first and most important step, the psychological one. And the second and not less important one, getting familiar with the equipment. Now, how do we use it? How do we handle it? But before, we have to know about the indications. There has to be an indication to perform a diagnostic hysteroscopy. It's very important. And here are the indications here. Plus, we have to make sure that there is no contraindication to it. And here's the list. The golden rule is the patient safety first and very important. Yes, the patient safety beyond any other consideration. So, we first examine the patient, perform a total scan. We give her a simple explanation about the procedure's technique, effects, and risks. And we obtain what we call an informed consent from her. This is very important. The diagnostic hysteroscopy should be performed at the first half of the menstrual cycle, because at this period of the cycle, there is no need for cervical dilation. We start with a bimanual examination to assess the uterus's position, shape, and volume. It is advised for beginners to start in an operating room under anesthesia for the comfort of the patient and the doctors as well. The equipment is checked and sterilized. However, it is a fact that office hysteroscopy is becoming a widespread routine procedure. It is performed without anesthesia in the first half of the menstrual cycle because there is no need for cervical dilation, and it allows diagnosis as well as small operating procedures. And again, for those who begin in hysteroscopy, it is always advised to start in an operating room before, so that one can improve one's dexterity while taking care of the patient's comfort. In my modest opinion, I think that those who are used to DNC, dilation and curettage under anesthesia, actually they could begin with a diagnostic hysteroscopy first. This way they would no longer have to blindly perform the DNC, and if they visualize a lesion, then they can go and remove a tissue sample, and after that they can finish with their usual DNC, of course if indicated. See, two birds with one stone. The technique now. You should know that 4 points will make it easy for you. 4 points plus 2 keywords. The four points first. How to hold the hysteroscope. That's the first thing. Second, how to make the white balance and adjust the camera to have a clear picture. Number 3, how to insert the hysteroscope. For this, it's very important to understand the notion of the viewing angle. And 4, how to guide the hysteroscope. First point, how to hold the hysteroscope. I suppose there are more than a way to hold it. In this demonstration, I'm telling you about the one I learned from the person I'm very grateful for in this matter. So take a look at my hand and the hand drawn in this picture. It looks like it wants to shake hands with somebody else. It's as if we wanted to shake hands, but with the hysteroscope. See my hand, as if I wanted to shake hands with someone, and I put the hysteroscope just on it like that. And then between the index and middle finger. Just like here, or here, as you might see on the picture. And we feel really comfortable when we hold it this way. We don't feel anything on our wrist. We can move. It's really interesting. Second point is the white balance. See, the scope, the light attachment, and the camera. Remember, we said that there are 2 buttons on the top of the camera. The black one for recordings and the white one for the white balance. So all we have to do is to turn on the light like that and come with the white compress near the scope to make it recognize the white color. And here's what we see on the screen, a white compress. Actually, white balance is showing the camera what the true white is, so that it can display all the other colors correctly. And just notice the small triangle at 6. This triangle indicates that the light cable is downwards. We can put it upwards if we want. It's up to every one of us. But I've learned to put it downwards when it comes to performing diagnostic hysteroscopy. So, to white balance the camera, we just press the white button on the top of the camera we put our hand, we press that button. We don't remove our finger till we see a small white square, then a big one in the center of the picture. There we know that the white balance is done and we remove our finger. See here, for example, we press the button, a small white square, then the bigger one. The white balance is done. And just after that, we adjust the focus of the camera to have a clear image. You can notice in this one, for example, that the picture is not quite clear in the middle. So what do? We just adjust the focus, like in the following video. Thanks to this small ring, we saw that the first big ring, the first one was for the camera, for the scope. The small one here is for adjusting the focus, like that. Just make sure that the rest of the camera doesn't move, just the small ring, like that. We move it and we adjust the picture. And now the third point, it's very, very, very important to understand what the viewing angle is. If you don't understand what the viewing angle is about, it will be difficult for you to understand how to insert and guide your hysteroscope. So what is a 30 degrees hysteroscope, for example? But maybe we should first understand what a 0 degree scope means. Actually, it means that the center of the picture corresponds to the center of the hysteroscope, which means that if we put the cervix in the center of the image, like here, the cervix will be on the way of the hysteroscope. So we'll just have to advance the hysteroscope and it'll get through the cervix. However, in a 30 degree scope, the center of the picture is 30 degrees upwards if the light cable is down, or 30 degrees downwards if the cable is up. So the center of the picture is no longer in the way of the scope. It's a little higher, like you see here in the picture. If the cable is down, the scope looks 30 degrees up. If the cable is up, the scope looks down. If the cable is to the left, the scope will look to the right, and vice versa. And now, what's the point of these 30 degrees devices? It's just that it gives a larger field of view. See the difference between the 0 degree and the 30 degrees that we rotate. If we rotate a 30 degree scope once upwards and once downwards, the field of view is so much bigger than this given by a 0 degree scope. Yet the problem is that, like a 0 degree, which makes the center of the image in the way of the scope, a 30 degree scope puts the center of the image 30 degrees upwards. If the light cable is downwards, of course, like we work here. And this means that if we put the cervix in the center of the picture, it won't be in the way of the scope. So if we put it in the center and advance, the tip of the scope won't get through it, but it will just hit the cervix lip or the vagina. So what do? We just have to put the cervix or any part we want to get through, not in the center of the picture, but it's in inferior part at 6. This way, when advancing the tip, will directly go through the cervix. And here's what 6 o'clock is all about. It's just the inferior part of the picture. Here's a real example with a uterus made of silicone. We put the cervix at 6, the inferior part of the picture, and we advance slowly, like that. And so the tips when it comes to the viewing angle is that the most frequently used scopes in diagnostic hysteroscopy have a 30 degrees viewing angle. And when you want to look upwards, you have to put the light cable down. If you want to look downwards, you have to put the light cable up. And it goes the same for the left or the right side of the uterus. If you want to see the right ostium, for example, you have to rotate the light cable to the left and vice versa. And the third tip is that if you feel like you're lost inside the uterine cavity and you no longer know where you are, just remove a little bit your hand, raise it, the hand supporting the camera, you raise the hand supporting the camera. This will make the tip of the telescope, yes, look down. And so it'll give you a panoramic view over the uterine cavity. So here's a demonstration. You have the cervix. What the scope sees is between the two straight lines. So this is a 30 degrees scope. We put the cervix down at 6 and we advance the tip millimeter per millimeter very slowly. So here's an example. This is the scope. For example, we insert it and advance slowly along the rear vaginal wall until we reach the fornix. And then we fill it with saline. When we insert the scope, we are letting the saline out. The saline is flowing. And once we get to the fornix, we fill it with saline so that it makes the cervix easier to locate. And then we put the cervix at 6, you see, at the, down the picture, not in the upper part of the picture, and not in the center of the picture. We put it at 6. Yes, not there, not in the upper part. So once it is at 6, we can advance the tip of the scope very slowly. We will penetrate the cervix. We get into the uterine cavity. And we go slowly, like millimeter per millimeter. It's very important. Once we reach the fundus, we rotate the cable. We put the cable here at 3, for example. To see what's happening at 9. The right ostium. And then we rotate the cable. We put it at 9 to see what's going on at 3, or the left ostium. And one of the most frequent attitudes of a beginner is, moving like that, those quick and nervous movements up and down, backward and forward. It's very bad. The point is to move very, very slowly and gradually, like millimeter per millimeter. It's very important. And here's a summary of what we've been saying. Don't forget the saline. You should put the saline on from the first moment when you penetrate the vulvar cleft. It's very important. The rest of the steps are all explained in this picture. And as you must have guessed, the two keywords we were talking about in the beginning are slowly and gradually. This is the trap when we begin, The point is not to get there first, but to carefully examine everything. So don't be quick. That's not the point. It's not about ending first. The point is to advance millimeter per millimeter, or half millimeter per half millimeter, like that. The patient's compliance depends on that too, especially in office hysteroscopy. In the next video, see how the beginner is moving upside down. Really, who can interpret that? See, actually, like all the videos, this is a beginner's one. See these quick nervous movements. See? Honestly, who can interpret images like that? I know I can't. You see a cervix here, and then the guy is stuck against the wall. He is lost, and then backward, forward, and forward again, and backward and forward. It's really impossible to interpret images like that, which is why it is very important to be slow and gradual. And now we'll see another procedure, a beginner's one too. That was one of my first ones ever in an artificial uterus. I put it inside a plastic bag that I cut just to imitate the vulvar cleft and the idea of vaginoscopy. I wanted to get inside the uterus without seeing the cervix, like in real life. So there we go. Sorry for the scope, it was a little bit dirty. So it was a beginner's test, not this of an expert. We put the cervix at 6. This way we can penetrate it. We progress very slowly. We explore the endocervical canal. Slowly, millimeter per millimeter. And then we get inside the uterine cavity. We see multiple polyps, a big one at 3 in the entry. You see? And we see kind of a septate in the fundus. The right ostium is visualized by rotating the light cable to 3. You see there are polyps around. Notice the triangle. Now we want to put it at 9 to see what's happening at 3, the left ostium, but we cannot see it because, because of that big mass here, this big polyp makes it impossible for us to visualize the left ostium. So what do? We move backwards a little bit. We can't see the ostium, so we try to go through between the polyp and the uterine wall. We put it at 6 too, and we penetrate this part. So we go to the fundus. We see here a little polyp. Look at the triangle. We put it at 9, and we see the left ostium at 3 with polyps too here, yes. So we visualized both ostia. Now we remove the hysteroscope very slowly. And sure, we have to do a lot of training to really get familiar with the equipment and the technique. And if an artificial uterus is not available, well, we can use a handbag, for example. That was mine here, the black one. I put it in a plastic bag. I put an object inside of it, and a beginner had to discover it with a camera. So this exercise has been done by a beginner. It was her first experience with the hysteroscope, her first experience ever. So just pay attention to the slowliness of her movements. That's how it should be done. Really slowly, never aim to be quick. Well, now she got inside the bag, and she's moving slowly. She has to identify the objects inside, and there, my green pan, she could identify. And now she's exploring the rest of the left part of my bag cavity. I'm discovering my bag from the inside too. I can't say that I hate it. It's pretty, it's pretty cool. The point is, we can do training on whatsoever. See, there's something here, a writing. She wants to read it with the camera. She goes slowly. There's A.G.R.I.Z.I. Adrizi, that was my name. And now you will identify this object. It was my rubber stamp. Here it is. So really the point is that we can do training with anything. You don't have to have artificial uteruses or whatever. You just go for whatever you have and do trainings on. Now, what about in real? As already said, we check and sterilize the equipment. It can be sterilized in an autoclave. All of it, except for the camera and the light source. Here we have the fiber optic cable and the scope in its black cover, and down we have the diagnostic and operative sheaths in the right and 3 instruments in the left. In the operating room, we use a camera drape to be able to work with it since the camera can't be sterilized. And sure, we can do it without anesthesia, but for the record, it's always good for beginners to start under anesthesia. This way, they can improve their dexterity while providing comfort to the patient. For your information, that was my first time ever in a real patient. She had an intrauterine lesion discovered 20 years after menopause. In my mind, I was going for a vaginoscopy. Why not trying after all? But as you see on the table, there were a speculum, a positive forceps, and dilators as well, in case I failed with vaginoscopy, so I could go for cervical dilation. You always should prepare a plan B. So let's take a look at the video. So here we go. The saline is on. I penetrated the vagina very quickly. Beginner's mistake. Then I remembered that I had to be slow. See? Slowly. Then I forgot again. So quick again. And here's the cervix. I realized that I had to be slow. It's very important. So I try to put the os at 6 so I can be able to insert the hysteroscope. See? There we are inside the cervical canal. See? First vaginoscopy. It was a success. But I was out of luck. There was a cervical stenosis. I couldn't go any further. So a few moments later, after cervical dilation, I wanted to get in the cervix like in vaginoscopy. So I filled the cervix with saline. I'm filling it. Yeah, I'm pouring the saline inside the fornix. Here's the cervix here. We put it at 6 and we get inside. The saline keeps dilating the canal. Here, just watch out. We can rotate the light cable to 3 or 9. It'll make it easier to penetrate, because the canal is larger than high. Now, here we are inside the uterine cavity and we see a big, unique polyp. The endometrium is inactive and flat, like in menopause. That was after menopause. So now we want to visualize the ostia. So we try to get under the polyp. Here we are, and see. Now I want you to pay attention to those lesions. You see these red lesions here? Well, actually, it's very probable that they are due to the dilation, the cervix dilation. So it causes traumatic lesions, and then it makes it difficult to interpret. We don't know whether it's post-traumatic or something else. This is why it is always advised not to dilate the cervix. When we can, it's always good not to dilate the cervix. But in this case, I had no choice. There was a cervical stenosis. So let's go. You see the ostium here at 1. We put the cable at 9 and we see the ostium. It's, normal. And now we try to go and visualize the right ostium. So we are rotating the cable to 3, and here's the ostium. You see? Here it is. And now we try to get on the top of the polyp. Try to see its pedicle. We go slowly, slowly. There it is. It's, covered with flat endometrium, regular vessels. So it's all right, it's good. And we remove very slowly. And after that, if we need to proceed to, a biopsy or to any operating procedure, we have to take off the diagnostic sheath, replace it with the inner operating sheath, and then we can insert the instruments through the working channel like scissors, biopsy forceps, or whatever we need. And just pay attention to one fact is that if you perform a biopsy or tissue sampling, you have to remove both the instrument and the hysteroscope together because the working channel doesn't allow passage to the tissue sample. It's very, very narrow. Now we're going to be able to see a few operating procedures like removing a foreign body here. So we get inside the uterus like already seen. At 6, slowly. We've talked about this many times. Let's suppose that something here in the middle is a foreign body. So we insert a forceps, the foreign body forceps. You're gonna see it. Here it is with its streaks. We take the foreign body and we remove both the instrument and the hysteroscope because that foreign body can't get through the working channel. We take it off and here it is. It's done. Now we're going to perform a tissue sampling or a biopsy. See, we have a little growth here that we want to remove. So we take the biopsy forceps, we open it, we take the growth, and we remove both the instrument and the hysteroscope. So here's the tissue sample. Here it is, done. And last thing we're going to see is working with scissors. In this example, it's a polyp that a beginner is trying to cut. It's not perfect, true. It's a beginner's act, so, but we can improve with time. This is what's good about it. Complications. We can't but talk about them. They exist, and they're not always related to the surgeon's skill, even if sometimes they are. You do know that any procedure in medicine has its own risks and complications. One of the most feared complications in hysteroscopy is the uterine perforation. You should know that it's very rare in diagnostic hysteroscopy because we work with really small instruments and, most importantly, we hold a camera in our hands. So we're not like doing it blindly. Yet, despite that, we can perforate. So how does it happen? Generally, it happens while forcing the passage through a tight cervix or stenosis, and bang, we perforate. And then we'll see the intra-abdominal organs with a hysteroscope. We know that we've just caused a perforation. If it's a simple one, first thing, stop the procedure straight away. Then use antibiotics and monitoring the patient during at least 24 hours. If the perforation is a complicated one, with hemorrhage, for example, or organs lesions, I think that we have to perform a laparoscopy. Well, that's what we should do. And in all the cases, one has to always be slow and gradual. No forcing, never ever. Always slowly and gradually under visual control. The other frequent complication is wrong ways, like in the first case, forcing the passage makes us create a new wrong path, and we discover that what we see doesn't look anything like the uterine cavity. In this case, slowly remove your hand and get to the right path. And again, never force anything. Remember the two key words, slowly and gradually. The patient's safety, very important, remember. Here are the other complications, like cervical trauma when forcing the passage again, or while performing exaggerated lateral movements with a hysteroscope, and that is precisely why we should always rotate the scope instead. For hemorrhage, you do know that When it's important, it makes it impossible to keep on examining the inside of the uterus. The view becomes mediocre. 5. Overload of liquid. Well, actually, it's not a common complication in diagnostic hysteroscopy, especially with normal saline. Actually, when it comes to diagnostic hysteroscopy, few milliliters are widely enough, and there has to be like a fluid deficit of more than 1.5 liters to cause overload problems. Apart from that, one of the most frequent complications in diagnostic hysteroscopy is failure itself, especially in office hysteroscopy. Failing to insert the scope or to pursue the procedure due to complications like perforation or hemorrhage or simply mediocre patient's compliance. Now, as for medium and long-term complications, we have infections of all types, so we have to particularly focus on surgical asepsis when performing hysteroscopy. Actually, antibiotics are not necessary, but a sterile procedure, that's very important. So we could also, apart from that, we could have uterine scarrings, obstetrical complications, especially after cervical trauma or a uterine perforation. All right, so there we are. We're done with the technique, the directions, and precautions for use. Let's move on with step number 4, getting familiar with the reference images. And step number 4. For the record, we've already seen 3 steps to performing diagnostic hysteroscopy in practice. The first and most important one was psychological. The second one was about getting familiar with the equipment. The third part was about getting familiar with the technical aspects. And now it's all about getting to know the reference images while examining the inside of the uterus, so that we know how to interpret what we see, what's normal, what's not. How does a cancer look like, for example, and so on. But before, you have to know that hysteroscopy is not supposed to give the histological answer. That is the biopsy's job. So whenever you have a doubt, perform a tissue sampling. This way you will have the right answer. So there is no need to anxiety as long as you can take samples and analyze them under a microscope. Plus, you do know that you can record what you see and ask for a second medical opinion in case you're not quite sure about a lesion. So this should make you feel less anxious because we can always have a second look. And again, if you're used to DNC, dilation and curettage, learn to start with the diagnostic hysteroscopy first. This being said, it is very important to understand what we see in the camera. And for that, keep watching. But first, my special thanks to the dear Dr. Adel Sedrati, without whom this work would have been incomplete. Really, my warmest thanks for sharing his iconography with us, for free, just for the love of science and sharing. And now, if you don't mind, I won't comment the following pictures. Since it is an atlas, the point here is to understand and memorize the reference images. My silence will help you focus more. Each picture is going to be displayed for 5 seconds. Think of pausing the video whenever necessary, and for as long as you please. All right, let's go. All right, so there we are. What's left after that? The post-operative report. On the report, we have to specify the medical indication for hysteroscopy, the day of the menstrual cycle it was performed, and the hormonal treatments if taken by the patient. We also have to specify the equipment we used in addition to the distending medium. In our case, we use normal saline. Plus, mention any type of difficulties we encountered throughout the procedure. First, we describe the possible vaginal lesions. Second, the cervix, its aspect, position, direction, and possible lesions. This goes for the cervical canal as well. And third, we give a full detailed description of the uterine cavity, its size, its inner configuration, its endometrium, ostia. Are there anomalies, lesions, fibroids, polyps, scarrings, suspect lesions, whatever. We have to assess and locate each one of these lesions. And at the end, we put a conclusion. Guess what? We're done with the 4 steps: the psychological one, the equipment, the technique, and the atlas of reference images. How good does it feel? Now it's time for the bonus. And the bonus has to do with the chicken. I'm going to tell you something. As gynecologists, we're quite familiar with the uterus and its endometrium. The problem is that we're very poorly used to the equipment, especially for those of us who are not quite familiar with endoscopy. One way of overcoming this is training. Remember, you have to touch it, get used to it. Your dexterity depends on that. Now, how do we do that? You know that not all of us have the opportunity to have a silicone uterus. But truth is, it doesn't really matter since we can train on something else, like a handbag or a box or, whatever. And even better, a very small chicken, like this one. See how small it is next to my finger. And most importantly, instead of going to Europe, for example, so that a blue-eyed guy prepares a pig model so that you train on it, you can still go to the butcher's next door and buy yourself a small chicken. It's not that expensive. Plus, you can even give it a name. I loved calling mine Dreamal. It was my dolly, the sheep. I'm just kidding. And as you see, I took off the wings and the legs. Here they are, both the legs and the wings. I'll tell you what I did with those later. And here is where I had to insert the scope. The places indicated by the yellow and the red arrows, especially the red one. You see how tiny is the hole indicated by the red arrow? So I immobilized the chicken's body on a small basin, and the small basin was in a bigger one so as not to have water everywhere when we put the saline on. Again, I wanted to penetrate the chicken, especially from that tiny little hole indicated by the red arrow. And before, I put the chicken inside a plastic bag to imitate the principle of vaginoscopy. I also assembled the equipment, put the saline on, and I started training. Here's the video. Here's the chicken. Here's the upper hole, the bigger one. I got inside, slowly and gradually. I'm examining the inside of the chicken. There, you see, a little bit of saline. Here, the green is the chicken's gallbladder, and that brown is the chicken's liver. The yellow is, fats. Here I'm trying to get inside the chicken through the lower hole, the small one indicated with the red arrow. I put it at 6 and here I was inside. Here's the inside of the chicken's belly. I'm examining and trying to see the cavity. There, here I was trying to use the scissors. I was cutting a piece of fat just to get used to the scissors. It was my first simulation exercise on a chicken. I was just having fun cutting things. Here I'm trying to get in through peritoneum. Well, I think that's peritoneum. Maybe that's not. So with the scissors, I cut through and see that little hole. I did that. So, that gives you really satisfaction to see that you're able to do things with the surgical instruments. Just exercise and just training. That's the point of the whole idea. You see? There, again. And the more I train, the more I feel, the better I feel about myself. This is the chicken's heart inside its pericardium. Actually, for your information, the chicken's heart is indicated by the red arrow here, and it is inside the pericardium, the gray arrow. So I kind of wanted to cut the pericardium to see the heart inside. Well, it was just, an idea. You just have to be creative when you do these kind of exercises. Here, I cut the pericardium, you see, very slowly with the scissors, and I got inside it. I got inside the pericardium. See, the more I train, the better I get. There's the pericardium too. And see, the more time I spend on these exercises, the better I get, and the more precise are my way of handling the scissors. Well, actually, that's not perfect, right? Actually, when you do that, you don't have to be perfect. That's the point, because you're not perfect. So you do that to become better and better, to have to improve your dexterity. And you see that the more I train, the more accurate my manners are. So here's the heart, or the pericardium. I got rid of it. And then I imagined the heart like a kind of a polyp, and I was cutting its big insertion base, just training. Again, that's not perfect. It's just about getting used to the scissors, for example. And that's the heart after the operation. See, there was no pericardium, and it was open. Here I was trying to perform a kind of tissue sampling. I used the foreign body forceps. I took a piece of fat, and I removed both the forceps and the hysteroscope. Every time I see this picture, I wonder what it's doing here. It kind of surprises me, especially now that I feel particularly hungry. For your information, that's what I did with the rest of the chicken. Remember, the wings, the legs, well, that's what I did with. And you know what? That was really yummy. Because, there's something very important to understand in life. It's always better to mix business with pleasure. And you know what they say, all work and no play makes the doctor, need I say more? Thank you for watching.